Hola a todos y todas, bienvenidos a Viaje al Sentido. Today we are doing our 83rd interview in Viaje al Sentido, and it's going to be the first one in English. So Chris, you have the privilege to be the first one that we will interview. We will do a full interview in English, and it's a privilege to have you here with us, Chris. Chris is professor of psychology at the University of Northampton and director of the Center for Psychology and Social Sciences that is based there. He is president of the Society for Psychical Research, chairman of the British Psychological Society Transpersonal Psychology section, past president of the Parapsychology Association, and the international affiliate for England of the Parapsychology Foundation. So very welcome and a privilege to have you with us, Chris.
Thank you for inviting me.
Chris, we're going to get very in-depth from the beginning and very intense. We'd like an answer on the big questions. So after your experience and your journey in life and the research and the extensive research you've done on parapsychology that you've done and that you've seen, what are the current answers that you have to the three big questions? Where do we come from, who we are, and where are we going?
I'm really sorry to disappoint you so early, but I can't give you answers to those questions except to say that the answers that we have within the current academic mainstream are clearly inadequate. So the answers that you'll be given from many spokespeople will say that consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, it's localized in the physical. It dies when the person dies and has abilities through the senses and through the motor systems. And those things don't seem to be true. They don't seem to be true in lived experience, in spontaneous ways in the real world, and they don't seem to be true in the laboratory either.
And why do you think it doesn't seem to be true?
Well, because I think scientists have an obligation to respond to people's experience every day and the beliefs that they have. And people's everyday experience suggests to them that under certain circumstances, they have phenomena that suggest that consciousness can be separate from the body. So that might be in the form, for example, of visiting a medium. And the medium might provide you with information that you regard as convincing evidence that your loved ones who've died still live. And they're still able to look down on you and have an interest in your life and can reminisce about experiences that you shared with them that are intimate, that nobody else knew about. Those kinds of experiences. Or somebody might report a near-death experience at a point in time when the brain doesn't seem capable of sustaining a conscious experience. Nevertheless, people say that at that time they were out of their body, looking down, watching the resuscitation attempt with a kind of a casual interest, not especially concerned that they might pass away. And those kinds of experiences are really challenging to account for in the conventional, the prevailing worldview.
And they're getting into there, Chris, you see with this phenomena, with this strange phenomena, you see like different taxonomy, no? In this world of parapsychology, no? See people that are talking about C phenomena.
Yes.
You see people talking about extrasensory perception, the famous ESP, that includes telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. You see people talking about psychokinesis, no, the ability to move things without touching them, no, the mediumship, then the near-death experiences, the out-of-the-body experiences. So what is the correct taxonomy and terminology in the science of parapsychology?
So this is at a very early stage. So our attempt is to understand these various phenomena. And the first step would be, as you say, to create a taxonomy. Are there phenomena that seem to have some kind of relationship with each other so that they might be explained in the same ways? And so in parapsychology, we tend to call all of these unusual phenomena that seem really difficult to account for in that materialist perspective or worldview. We call those psi, PSI, and that's just the Greek letter psi to stand for something that's not yet understood. It's kind of used almost as we do in algebra, where if there's an unknown property, we give it a letter like X, and psi works in that way. And so in trying to understand those phenomena, there seems to be a class of phenomena that seem to involve knowing things about the world, but without that knowledge coming from our senses. So we can see the world around us, we can hear things, we can interact with other senses and learn about the world in that way. But sometimes people have experiences that go beyond that. So you mentioned things like telepathy. People might have an embodied experience at the very moment when a relative is involved in an accident, and they might feel that accident in a very direct way that didn't come through the senses. Or they might have a premonition. They might have an experience that hasn't yet happened, that relates to a future event, and they're convinced that that experience is a premonition of that future event. Now, as a scientist, we come into those experiences truly skeptical. We don't prejudge them, we honor them, we appreciate them as being earnest accounts of an experience, and our task is then to explain them. Another class of phenomena you mentioned is psychokinesis. So sometimes people think that physical phenomena happen around them that they haven't caused by the normal means. So if I want this mouse to levitate, I have to physically pick it up, and then it levitates, and then it settles back on the desk. But some people claim that maybe at a peak of emotion, maybe they're extremely angry or frustrated about something, and a physical phenomenon might happen all by itself. And so again, that seems to be impossible. And so our task is to provide an explanation that accounts for it. And then the third class is your survival category. So a whole range of phenomena, like the examples we already gave, near-death experiences, mediumship encounters, but also things like apparitions. People might have a spontaneous experience of somebody that's passed away, maybe soon after they've died. Or people might report that their child is talking about a previous life that they've lived. And those experiences are really interesting to us in potentially giving us some evidence for possible survival.
And then how can you defend, Chris, that parapsychology is a science? Because there are many people that would say and would argue that these are like individual accounts, and that this is just subjective experiences with an n equal to 1.
Absolutely.
And that probably there is something else going on that you're not realizing, and all skeptics think, and many skeptics think, that parapsychology is nothing more than a pseudoscience. No, so how can you defend that parapsychology is really a science?
I mean, there are a number of features to that. So first of all, there's this idea that you dismiss something as simply an anecdote. People report an experience in their everyday life, and of course they could be mistaken. There might be factors at work that they're not aware of, or they may have misperceived or misremembered the situation. But of course, that's true of any human experience. And if we simply threw everything away, any account of a memory or an experience, an eyewitness testimony of a crime, if all of that was completely dismissed, we wouldn't be able to move anywhere. So the key, of course, is, as a scientist, is to take those claims and start to explore the ways in which we might explain them by normal means. What might those factors be? And start to build those into our models and our experimental tests. So a really good example might be with mediumship. So if you sit with a medium and they give you information that seems to be really impressive, a skeptic might say, well, of course, the medium might have known that you were coming to sit with them, and they might have done some research on the internet and found out all about you in that way. So if we want to do an experimental test, we make sure that the claimant, the medium, has no way of knowing about the clients before the interaction, the sitting takes place. We might say, well, people give away information non-verbally when they're interacting with each other, and maybe the medium is picking up on that non-verbal information, and that's helping them to arrive at accurate information. So again, in an experiment, we can build in maybe an experimental condition where you don't actually see the clients. They're behind a screen or they're watching through a CCTV, and see if that affects the performance, if it affects the quality of the information. So there are lots of ways as a scientist where we can move away from the real world and the anecdote into a situation where we have much more control over the variables and can start to test those counter explanations very directly and see if they can explain away the phenomena.
And what are the most common typical research projects on sea phenomena and ESP? What in the last 20, 30 years, what have been the most common typical research projects?
As you can imagine, it's such an enormous field because there are lots of different kinds of phenomena that ordinary people think, well, that's unusual. That seems to suggest that I am a spiritual being, that I am more than my biology. So it can be quite diverse. But if we take ESP as an example, so the idea that people do have information that they collect from the world psychically, well, I think that the latest developments seem to suggest that there's something very important about altered states of consciousness. That ordinary people who don't claim to be psychic will have these occasional experiences in their lives, and they seem to happen at times when people are maybe drifting off to sleep or dreaming, or maybe meditating, or involved in some kind of monotonous task where they're daydreaming a little bit. And so it's those occasions when the ego isn't directly involved and you're not concentrating. That seems to be when people have their spontaneous psychic experiences. And so that's what we try and do in the laboratory. We try and induce these very mild shifts of consciousness. So people are a little bit sleepy, their imagination can run a little bit wild. And that seems to be a really productive way of capturing ESP effects in the laboratory. And then a spin-off from that, which is really exciting over maybe the last 15 years or so, is that maybe sometimes people acquire information that they have no conscious awareness of, that it's an unconscious knowledge, but maybe it's reflected in their body, in their physiological reactions, or it's reflected in the decisions they make. So if you present people with two images and say, which one of these are you attracted to the most? I'll go with this one. And they get a reward if they choose the correct one. At no stage do people think that they're being psychic, but nevertheless, they do better in those tasks than they should do. They get the desired result, they get rewards, and they avoid punishments in ways which is really cool and kind of suggests that ordinary people may be utilizing or exploiting psi all the time without knowing about it. You know, you might think of yourself as quite a lucky guy. You know, choices just seem to work out for you. Opportunities arise just when you need them. Well, maybe this suggests that some of that might be psi mediated, that we're creating those opportunities in our decisions and our behaviors in very subtle ways that we don't have any conscious knowledge of.
You will agree that most of there are a lot of skeptics in the veracity of sea phenomena and on these research projects. And sometimes the arguments they use is that most of the people that are in the field, like you, are usually people that believe in psychology, you know? So there is this famous confirmation bias, no? And that most of the research have in the field. So what are the typical flaws that you have in these experiments, and are they really, I mean, right now the science of parapsychology, are they really taking into account all these different flaws that the experiments can have?
Well, the biases that you talk about, Javier, are exactly the biases we have as human beings. And it's not particularly new. Francis Bacon in the 1600s was talking about these biases that we had. In many ways, he's the father of the scientific method. And so Francis Bacon was saying, well, here are some methods we can use to kind of control for those tendencies and biases, those confirmation biases. And we all have them. If you're a neuroscientist, you have your own biases. You tend to confirm certain things that you expect to see and to not notice things that you don't expect to see. It's true of us all. So all we can ever do is rely on a scientific method, an objective recording of findings, and a very systematic approach to analyzing the data to make sure that we're controlling those things, or at least making them transparent. I don't think parapsychology suffers any more from that than any other empirical science.
And Chris, how big is this field? I mean, how can you quantify a bit the magnitude of the research done in the last century in parapsychology, just in order to get an idea of how big this field has evolved during the last century?
Well, unfortunately, it's a very small field. And that's because there is still a taboo around working in this particular area, because it is so challenging to a mainstream received view about what it is to be a human being. And so there are relatively few people involved. I think we would count them in the hundreds, certainly rather than thousands of people who are active in parapsychology at the moment. And I think because of that, it's actually quite astonishing that we've accumulated the database that we have. Although people have been actively interested for over 100 years, the Society for Psychical Research that you mentioned when introducing me, that was founded in 1882 by a group of Cambridge academics who were very interested in using the scientific method to understand evidence for survival. And so there's a long history, over 100 years, 140 years or so, but with relatively few people involved. And a colleague some time ago estimated that the number of human person hours involved in parapsychology is about the same as a summer of American psychology. And, but people don't throw their hands up in the air if we don't make some great, profound discoveries over a single summertime. And I think in the same way, although we're accumulating interesting findings and starting to discern patterns, I don't think we're yet at the stage of having any great discoveries about what that alternative explanation might be, that alternative framework.
You mentioned at the beginning the importance of doing science in parapsychology, because if it really demonstrates that it's finally that these phenomena are finally true, it clearly opens a door for a new paradigm on reality and how we understand reality, no? So, and we're gonna get into the hard data and evidence, no? But the question here is, do you think that right now the investment in doing science in parapsychology is sufficient to really produce whatever, either the good or the bad evidence, to make it clear whether this is true or false, or whether this is really something that is real or something that is just something invented by the mind or whatever?
Again, there are a number of features there that are really important to unpack. So to begin with, we've used the term pseudoscience a few times already in this conversation. And I think it's important to stress that no claim or a reported phenomenon is in itself pseudoscientific. Everything's wrapped up in the approach we then take to document and trying to explain the phenomena. And the people who are working in the field are scientifically trained. They're trained in the same universities as people working in any other discipline. They have the same kinds of qualifications as those people. They just use their expertise to try and explore these particular rather puzzling phenomena. So that's our starting point. The other challenge that's sometimes offered is to say, well, of course, if you can demonstrate that these phenomena are real, then this would cause some kind of a scientific revolution. It would overturn everything that we believe that we understand. And that's rather perplexing, because that doesn't at all follow. On the one hand, we're expecting a scientific revolution sometime soon, because we have a fundamental contradiction between the two prevailing theories. The most successful theories that we have are relativity and quantum mechanics, and they're fundamentally incompatible. So something has to change in order to accommodate both of those within a singular framework. That affords a revolution. Secondly, neither of those theories has anything at all to say about consciousness. Neither predicts that consciousness should occur or attempts in any way to describe its nature. Therefore, we would need to have some kind of a revolution that deals with the special phenomenon of consciousness. As somebody who's trained in psychology, that's exactly where I'm starting from, is, well, consciousness is, as Descartes said before, the fundamental property of the world as I experience it. So my starting point is to try and understand consciousness. And none of the theories we have at the moment come anywhere near explaining the key features of consciousness. So there is a need for something there, absolutely.
Now we're getting into the evidence. We're getting into the hard data, no? So there's been a century of research, no? So how would you demonstrate us there is really a strong case for evidence on C phenomenon,
So the first thing to say is we need to make the right kind of comparison between the evidence that we've accumulated in parapsychology and other equivalent sciences. And one technique that's often used by skeptics is to try and make a comparison with the natural sciences. So if you're working in physics or in chemistry, for example, you can measure things with great precision, and you can expect your phenomena to replicate. So if something is true, if you do perform one action in one situation, you put a bunch of chemicals together in this laboratory, you get the same reactions as you would get in another laboratory. That doesn't apply in the social sciences. In the social sciences, our subject matter is conscious, it's sentient itself. I've run experiments before where my participants were running their own experiments in my experiment. So, of course, there are consequences. That means that in the social sciences generally, so, psychology, human geography, sociology, we don't see those kinds of properties in our experiments. Instead, we see effect sizes and we see replication across a whole body of evidence. So if a dozen people conduct the same experiment, they won't all get the same result, but there will be a shift. They will all tend to show glimmers of the phenomenon. And there'll be a little kind of distribution over here when it should be over here. And in parapsychology, what we find is our effect sizes are about the same size as we see in other areas of psychology. So it suggests a human attribute. Our replication rates are about the same as we see in other areas of psychology. So there's nothing peculiar or unusual about parapsychology. There's nothing especially delicate about the phenomena we're looking at because they're spiritual in nature in some way. That means that they're harder to produce or that they're more difficult to replicate. The bottom line is relatively few people attempt those replications in the first place. If more people did, we'd have a much larger body of evidence. So to answer your question more directly, I think the evidence we have is very respectable in comparison with the evidence we see from other disciplines. It's just a smaller database because there are fewer people working.
Well, now I'm gonna put a skeptic hat.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm gonna throw you two arguments to kind of put in doubt the evidence. No, the first argument, Chris, is that the reality to date in this last century, parapsychologists have probably failed to produce at least robust and replicable evidence for paranormal phenomena. No? And there was clearly a hype on research in the 70s and the 80s, where even the CIA got into it with the intention to see through precognition or clairvoyance that they could see or anticipate things on the communist side or that. But the results really weren't strong enough, and they left the field. So what would you say to people that say that after 50 years of quite a lot of strong piece of research, there is clearly not a substantial evidence on this phenomenon?
Well, I think I'd refer back to my earlier answer and just ask, well, what would count as a robust body of evidence? It's interesting, for example, that you mentioned the remote viewing work with the US military and intelligence agencies. But of course, they spent over $20 million over more than 20 years supporting that initiative. So if they were incapable of producing any information that was useful to them, it beggars belief that they spent so long financing it over such a long time. So I think that probably misrepresents that database as well. I think what we see are phenomena that absolutely replicate in much the same way as any other human capacity. If we're looking at, for example, empathy or altruism, if we're looking at some fairly basic phenomena in memory or perception, I don't think the evidence here is any less robust. I don't think it's any more meager. I think absolutely bears comparison. And I guess if we had a longer conversation, I'd be asking, well, let's have a look at some of the evidence, and maybe you can share with me what exactly your problems are with the data, why you think it's not very impressive, or why you think the effects are small. Because from my perspective, they kind of look like what we would expect to see if it involves human beings.
And the second argument that I have is, and you're very familiar with it, it's the white crow experiment, no? That we know that all crows are black, no? But if there was only one white crow that could be validated constantly in a controlled trial, it would be enough to validate the whole sea phenomenon, no? But that is not the case yet. No, yeah, and I'm sure you're familiar also with the $1 million paranormal challenge of James Randi, no, that offered 1 million to anyone that could demonstrate on a regular basis in a controlled trial a paranormal ability, and that seemed never to happen. So why is it that difficult to find one single individual that could demonstrate constantly that he has a paranormal ability in a controlled trial?
Well, again, my first response is, are there other areas of human achievement where we do expect that? So, for example, if we were told that there's this guy, Lionel Messi, who's very good at scoring goals, and we turn up and watch him in one match and he fails to score, is that a refutation of the claim? Are we saying that Messi isn't a goal scorer at all? If we hear about a wonderful comedian and we give them 30 seconds, okay, hit me with your best gag, and their joke we don't find particularly funny, does that mean this person isn't a comedian or an artist, and they produce a piece of work, a sketch from Picasso? Some sketches are less impressive and less impactful than other sketches, even from Picasso. And we don't in those situations think that completely undermines the claim, because if you really have this attribute, you should be able to use it 100% and demonstrate it to order. That doesn't seem to be how human beings are. And if we give one example, for example, which is that human beings' performance is very much affected by situational factors. And when we go back to sports, for example, sports people are very superstitious. And one of the reasons they're superstitious is because the situation is out of their control. There are so many factors over which they have no control that they use that as a way of eliciting a sense of control, and very subtle things can affect you really badly. So you tackle early on in a game and suddenly you're not really feeling yourself very well, and your performance through the whole match is terrible. And yet the very next day, for no reason that's obvious that you could put your finger on, you're man of the match, you're the player of the game or the tournament. So some things have changed very subtly and produce enormous differences. And I think the same is true here. Human beings' performance are massively affected. Just imagine the occasion you go for a job interview and your sense from an early question is that one of the panel members is very cold towards you and isn't terribly impressed. That can completely put you off. And this could be the worst interview you've ever given in your life, and you certainly don't get the job. So those kind of things we have to be aware of if we're talking about human beings, that it probably isn't realistic to think about a white crow in that respect. But we absolutely have a number of individuals. Some of those people are still giving demonstrations. People like Joe McMoneagle, who worked on the remote viewing program, for example. When he was alive, somebody like Ingo Swann, Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Leonard as mediums, who between them were tested for something like 60 years. Not continually, so not in a single stretch, but over 60 years they gave mediumship demonstrations to the satisfaction of the researchers, and were never once caught cheating, for example. Some days were off days, the information was not very good at all. On other days it was astonishing. So that, I think, is more typical of human performance.
Let's get even deeper.
Oh,
Hard data. Chris, and you have shared with me a wonderful conversation you have on an article with Chris French. You're more optimistic. He's more probably pessimistic on the evidence.
sure.
You get really in depth with the evidence done in the last century, and especially with the meta-analysis. That those research that investigate a group of research done during a certain period of time. And at one point of time, you mentioned a meta-analysis done by Cardeña in 2018, in which clearly it says that in 2018, American psychologists published an article by Professor Etze Cardeña, which systematically reviewed the evidence for C phenomenon, examining over 750 discrete studies. Cardeña concluded that there was a very strong case for the existence of she, writing that the evidence was comparable to that for the established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. So this is the point you were trying to make all the time. And are your opinions mainly based on this meta study of Cardeña or meta-analysis of Cardeña, or I suppose that in many other pieces of evidence, but this is clearly one top one, no, Chris?
I think it's a combination. So I think I've arrived at that conclusion independently, though it's nice to talk about this article, which is more accessible and intended for a general audience. Meta-analysis is rather a peculiar technique. It reflects, as we said before, the idea that in the social sciences, we wouldn't expect, even with a real phenomenon, that every experiment would show evidence of the phenomenon. But instead, if we have a cluster of experiments, we would expect to see them shifted so that they have more evidence collectively than we maybe see in one or two individual experiments. And so that's what Etzel Cardeña is talking about through that article. And that it is comparable to what we see in other areas of psychology. So I think those two features are really important in that article. But equally, I'm a human being as well. And I think it's been really important to me that in our own laboratory in Northampton, we have been able to reproduce these phenomena, where we are in control of all of the variables. And we know exactly that we did things properly, that there's no way for people to cheat. There's no way for people to acquire information by any normal means. And nevertheless, when we do the analysis, people are producing impressions about the target that relate to the target much more than we would expect by chance, highly significantly. So I guess in a rather selfish way, not quite practicing what I preach, I think for me it has been important to also document those phenomena in my own lab, either personally or through research associates. And I think one thing that we can do maybe better is to produce more versions of experiments that regular people with some scientific training perhaps could try out for themselves. Because the bottom line is this: if these phenomena are real, then they're real. Other people, when they look for them, will find them too. There's nothing special about me as a researcher or Etzel Cardeña as a researcher. Any competent researcher, if they do these experiments, they should find the same pattern of results as we find.
And there, Chris, the other Chris French, replicated you with another meta-analysis of Kekets from 2023 that was concluding on the other side, that there was really no case for the sleep phenomena after studying and reviewing all the literature. So what do you have to say on that?
Yeah, so that's quite a technical point. So that study was actually not a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where lots of people have run their own experiments and they've then published those experiments in journals and so on. And then somebody else comes along and pulls all of those reports together to produce that analysis. What they have instead is a kind of a meta-study. So a number of people conducted experiments simultaneously in their different labs, and then they pool all of the data. And I think in that commentary, I talk about how this is a really important innovation. There are lots of really very positive features to the experiment that they've conducted. But unfortunately, what they left behind was the fact that they're working with human beings, and that the actual design of the experiment was not tailored to produce an effect. And it's quite frustrating to me as somebody who is trained in psychology, is to see how many psychologists treat their participants as if they're data generators. You know, if they're doing this perception task, all they're interested in is how these people perceive. But they come as a human being, as a whole rounded person. They interact with you as the researcher when they first turn up. They might be students of yours in your department and maybe are worried that, you know, if they do badly in your experiments, that'll count against them when it comes to maybe having you as their supervisor in third year. Those kind of things might be on their minds. And so it's really important, in my view, as a psychologist, to create a psychological space for participants that allows them to behave naturalistically. And in experiments like the Kekesh one, the problem is, in my view, that they don't do that. You know, that they encourage people to quickly get on with this, to perform, to get this out of the way. A good example in parapsychology is generally it's thought not a good idea to pay participants to be in our experiments. You might cover their expenses, but you don't want to pay them for their performance. And that's because that adds an extra layer of expectation and concern, you know, to the situation and complicates it. And instead, what we want is for people just to relax and enjoy the experience. And when that happens, ironically, that's when the performance comes as well. It's a little bit like if you're struggling to get to sleep at night. You know, the worst thing you can do is stay in bed, try and force yourself to go to sleep. It won't happen. You have to, in some way, fool your ego, you know, in some way. Think about something else, or get up and go, you know, make a milky drink or something, and then come back later on to break that cycle. And the same is true in many psychology experiments. If you want the participant to behave naturally and not to perform to produce the result they think that you want, that tends to be very counterproductive.
Where do you think are the most promising experiments right now in the field? And the question here is, what do you, what would you like to happen in the next 10, 15 years that could clearly change things in parapsychology? I mean, what are promising research experiments going on, and where do you think, where do you see a space where it could really create a very strong evidence that could change things?
So for the first one, I think we're exploiting advances in technology. I think that's really exciting. So an obvious example that I mentioned earlier is the idea that we're much more able now to monitor physiological reactions to situations than we were able to before. So to measure unconscious psi. So a really cool example of that is you might have an experiment, which will be a standard psychology experiment, where you show people images, photographs on screen, and sometimes they're very positive images, so it might be a picture of a smiling baby, and sometimes it might be a negative image. It might be a very aggressive dog, or it might be a car accident. And as you might imagine, when people see those images, they react physiologically. They might even say, I don't mind these photographs, even the horrible ones, I can cope with those quite well, but their body tells a different story, and they react very strongly to the negative images, and they react only a little bit to the positive images. And what we've discovered is that people are reacting to the images before they appear on the screen. Their body seems to already know what's about to happen, even before the computer's decided what kind of image to show next.
Wow.
So the idea that we're gearing up for those kind of things. Now, of course, 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't have the technology to do that kind of an experiment. And building on that, I think the advances in neuroscience are really exciting, because even if psi suggests that some aspect of consciousness goes beyond the brain, it is still mediated by the brain. So the brain is absolutely still involved. And so the more we can monitor the brain and understand what kinds of activity are psych-conducive, what do we see in people who are doing really well at our ESPA experiments, and what when people are doing really badly, that will give us some kind of an insight into mechanisms. And in particular here, we think there are some mechanisms that might inhibit psi. that might stop people having many more of these experiences because they could be distracting or overwhelming for people. So I think that kind of work is really exciting. The other thing that's really exciting, I think, is in terms of finding patterns in performance. So we're starting to get a better sense that some people are better than other people at our controlled laboratory experiments. And these are people who might identify as particularly creative, for example, people who get highly absorbed in the tasks and forget that they're involved in an experiment at all. They're so immersed in the actual experience. And so there seems to be features that are patterns that we can now start to theorize about. So what do they tell us about the nature of the phenomenon and how it operates? So I think we are getting very close to a stage where we can start to build and test models, maybe not an overarching theory, but some models about phenomena, which is really exciting.
Also, there is this idea that some of the sea phenomena only happen under altered states of consciousness, no? Profound states of meditation, or in a calm state, or induced by a psychedelic. So, is there evidence on that? That there is a correlation between sea phenomena and whether you are in altered states of consciousness?
Well, certainly we see that. If we go back, there's a long history. So with the foundation of the great religions, so Buddhism and Hinduism from the East, for example, but also in the mystical traditions of Judaism and Christianity, we see very much a focus on the idea of contemplation being a way in which we develop refinement and a more subtle awareness of ourselves and our capacities. And those are the times when people have these so-called siddhis, these spontaneous paranormal experiences. We see that also, as I mentioned before, in ordinary people's spontaneous experiences, that they might be drifting off to sleep, or they might be washing the dishes and, daydreaming. That's when these things happen, not when they're actively engaged, in a very deep conversation like this one. We won't have a psychic experience right now. And then finally, we can bring that into the laboratory and, yes, use some of the technologies that we use to shift people so they're in a mild, what we'd call a hypnagogic state, a kind of a state just as you're drifting off to sleep. That does seem to be psych-conducive for ordinary people who don't claim to be psychics. And as you mentioned, people like mediums, some mediums go into trance, for example. So there might be other people, even a light trance, so you're still aware of your surroundings. People have used those as devices or methods. Psychedelics research might be another that's really cool. We're seeing an opening up now of opportunities to do research with psychedelics under controlled circumstances. And I think that's very exciting for us as well, because they can also play a role in helping to shift people's attention to sources of psi information and away from our other senses. So that would fit in really well.
And one very promising field also, Chris, are the near-death experiences. No, there's a growing evidence on the existence of near-death experiences. No, so I was wondering, where are we standing at the moment with the NDAs? Are we close to getting somewhere, or is it just a growing field that still is based on individual accounts, and there are not still those many research projects done that could really demonstrate that the phenomenon is ontologically real? No,
I think we're faced with a challenge because the mainstream view is extremely robust and well established. And it takes a long time to break that down through evidence, counterfactual evidence. I think we're really helped again by technological advances, because in the time when Ray Moody was first talking about NDEs in the 1970s, resuscitation wasn't terribly successful. So most people who were near death died. Now we have a fabulous situation where many more people who have been clinically dead can actually be revived and come back to life and have an opportunity to share with us their experiences that they might have had. So it will lead to an opening up of data. We'll have much more material to work with. And that allows us then to do more systematic work. So, for example, do people tend to have NDEs only with certain health conditions and not others? Are they affected by various kinds of treatments? So things like naloxone that's often given, does that impact on the after a cardiac arrest? Does that impact on the particular kind of experience that you might have later on? And if we start to see more patterns there again, that might lead us to a situation where we can start to theorize a bit better. But at the moment, the focus mainly seems to be on showing that the current view is wrong, rather than providing an alternative view.
Let me get in this. We're getting to the end, Chris, but I would like to get a bit more personal now.
Okay.
We've already gone through the evidence and the existing evidence, but now I have a personal question. Chris, what have you seen with your eyes that is extraordinary? What have been like subjective experiences for you that have really, I mean, you haven't been able to explain it with a materialistic point of view, that have been magic or something extraordinary, but that you've really seen it with your eyes, or that have been very close to it?
I'm going to start by mentioning that in my office here, I have a spoon that's got a twist and a kink in it, like a psychokinesis effect.
Yeah.
And that was produced for me by a friend and a colleague at the end of a conference where we were having a cup of tea together in a kind of a reception. And he asked me for my spoon, and I passed it over. He flicked it up. He never touched it, and it landed on the floor with a bend and a twist in it. And he's a sleight of hand magician.
Wow.
And so he produced it by trickery. And I have that in my office to remind me, like every other human being, that I'm a very poor observer. And that the way I think things happened may not be a guarantee of how things actually happened. So I think that's really, for humility's sake, it's really important that personal observations are not given too much credence. Having said that, I'm also somebody who came to parapsychology not because I had personal beliefs or experiences. I came as somebody who wanted to be a scientist and to do research on the big questions that you started with. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the purpose of all this? And came to psychology as a way of trying to answer some of those questions. I have many colleagues who did have personal experiences early on in life, and that's been a driving force for them, but not for me. And I'm not a particularly psychic kind of person. I haven't had lots of personal experiences in my everyday life. But I have been involved in a great deal of research, which has been quite successful. And within that, some of that research has been jaw-droppingly accurate. So I can recall occasions when we have our standard situation where we'll have a participant in that mild altered state. So they'll be in a very comfortable chair, reclined. They'll have eye shields on and headphones on. And we ask them to imagine taking a look at a video clip that's been randomly chosen by a computer for one among hundreds of clips, and they've no idea what those clips might include, the videos, and they give their description of what's coming into their imagination. And we write that down, and then we show them 4 video clips, the one that is their target, and 3 alternatives, 3 decoys. And of course, only the computer knows which is which. We don't know which is which. And on some of those occasions, the correspondences between the imagination and the video clip that we see that turns out to be the target, it's as if somebody has watched the video clip and then said, okay, well, what can I remember of that video clip? Somebody came running down some stairs, a car came driving by really quickly. You know, it's quite literal and extremely difficult to account for just in terms of a chance coincidence. Now, I say all of this, I want to be sure that anybody watching this interview doesn't necessarily think that I'm kind of trying to persuade people that these phenomena are all real. Absolutely. The most important message I want to get across is the only way to investigate these phenomena is scientifically, and that nobody wants to fool themselves. You know, if it turns out that we're mistaken, that none of these phenomena are real, I think as a society, as humankind, would be better off knowing that fact. So I am very open to the idea that that phenomena will be disproven in the experiments that we conduct. But I have to say, to date, certainly when it comes to ESP, that's not what we found. we've built up a really healthy database of effects. Now, for psychokinesis, I've done some research with PK, and that hasn't been at all successful. So personally, I am much more skeptical about PK than I am about ESP.
Chris, let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you mentioned before that you think consciousness is something more than the brain, no? And you even suggested that consciousness is like the basic ingredient of the universe, no? So what's going to happen with artificial intelligence? No, everyone thought that artificial intelligence couldn't be that much intelligent. Now it's very intelligent. People thought it couldn't be creative. Now it seems it's very creative. No, so do you think it will get to a point where artificial intelligence will have parapsychology powers, or do you think? Or maybe a simple one, no? Do you think artificial intelligence will become conscious at one point of time? Will have consciousness emerging from artificial intelligence, from complexity within neural networks? It will get to a point that the accumulation, or for whatever factor, it will emerge consciousness from non-conscious, no?
It's really difficult to answer, and there are a number of answers. So as you were talking, it reminded me of Alan Turing. So Alan Turing is one of the founders of modern computing. Writing in the 1930s and 1940s, he developed something called the Turing test as a way to find an identifier of intelligence that might differentiate between human beings and computers. And one of the ways in which he thought that a computer would never pass the Turing test was if you believe that ESP is possible. And Alan Turing, at that time, writing in the 1940s, believed that the evidence was strong for ESP and that this could be a way in which computers would never be able to pass the Turing test. I'm not so convinced. I think it's very possible. If consciousness is a product of complexity of information processing, then of course computers may be able to have the properties, the features of consciousness. And if one of the byproducts of being a conscious being is that you at times can be entangled with other conscious beings, that you can extend beyond yourself, then I'm open to the possibility that computers also would share that ability. So that confuses things. Some of the theories of consciousness that are non-local see consciousness everywhere. Some of them are more panpsychist, and so they see all matter as actually being an emanation of a fundamental conscious property. So, of course, your AI machine is already made up of the materials that themselves are conscious. So it would be reinventing itself, coming in a loop in a kind of a way. So I see no reason to exclude that on principle. I think AI is quite scary, but at the same time could be an enormously powerful tool over the next 15 or 20 years, particularly in terms of analyzing and making sense of our data and learning more from it than maybe we can just as human beings.
Chris, I have one last question, and we should,
okay,
because we're already out of time. But you mentioned before that, for instance, you see more evidence on ESP than on psychokinesis. I was wondering, where are you seeing the most prominent advances for the next 5-10 years? In what areas, or what really researchers around the world are right now in the edge with the experiments that we can see something very special and very extraordinary within the next 5-10 years? Where should we look at in terms of fields and in terms of people?
Well, I think some of it revolves around this convergence of some features that suggest that there's something important about unconscious processing that we do as human beings, which isn't at all controversial. You know, the idea that much of the way in which we gather information and make sense of it, we have no conscious awareness of at all. We just get the results of that. And some of those research approaches seem to reflect that idea that psi might enter the system unconsciously. And that's also reflected in the altered states work, because when people are in altered states, the boundary between the conscious ego and unconscious becomes thinner. So it's more permeable, information passes through. That fits in with that. And some of the neuroscience work that's going on at the moment that might allow us to identify the mechanisms that control that boundary between conscious and unconscious, that I feel like they're all coming together. And if they do paint a common picture, I think that will be really exciting going forwards. The other answer is more practical. I think even though we are a small community, as I say, hundreds rather than thousands, I think what we could hope to do is to coordinate our activity better so that we're all working on a common problem, you know, in that kind of meta experiment thing that we talked about earlier. If we did a little bit more of that, then I think we could maybe make more substantial advances, because we're all addressing the same problem areas at the same time. I think that would be a good thing to do.
And three or four people that you admire in the field that we should take a look at, the people that are interested in the field?
If people are interested in the field, I think I would start with people who are public facing. So people like Dean Radin, for example, Julia Mossbridge, or people who write popular accounts which are really well grounded in what's actually going on in the field. But these days, frankly, so many people do things like podcasts or interviews. There's the New Thinking Aloud collection of interviews that people might want to check out as well. There are lots of ways where you can access the whole community of researchers, and they're all wonderful people, as you might imagine. This is a discipline that weeds out people. You really have to be committed to the scientific method and believe that something important is going on here if you're ever going to be able to get tenure or eke out a living working in this area. And so it tends to be survival of the fittest. So I think it would be interesting to listen to any of those people.
Chris, it's been wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for your time. I think we did great, and I think we did great in English for the first interview of our podcast. So thank you very much, Chris, and it's been an honor to have you.
Thank you. I hope people understand me. I have a regional accent and I talk quickly, but I hope people were able to understand some of it.
For sure. Take care.
Great.
Bye.
See you soon.